70 years ago, 500 young Scots risked their lives by volunteering to fight in another country's war. This remarkable group of men threw themselves headfirst into the bloody struggle against fascism. A third never returned. They were the Scots who fought Franco. The Spanish Civil War waged General Franco's alliance of military leaders, monarchists, conservatives, and most of the Catholic Church against a Republican government coalition of socialists, communists, and anarchists. Franco's side were bolstered by military assistance from Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, while the Republican side received assistance from Stalin's Soviet Union. Additionally, 35,000 volunteers flooded into Spain to combat the threat of fascism. 549 of them were from Scotland. Through a series of interviews, gathered over a decade and never before seen, they continue their story.
You just need to say that you're an International Brigader. Here we are 60 years later, and if you meet somebody who's an International Brigader, there's John and myself too, a couple of old men, but you never forget the experience of having been together there, and there is a comradeship which knows no bounds.
The comradeship of the International Brigade, the battalion, the International Brigade, they were there from Cuba, America, Canada, Australia, Britain, Ireland, you name it, they're all there. And it was a comradeship with us all, and the comradeship of the Spanish people that will always live in my memory. I'll never forget it. Never forget the experience.
In the summer of 1937, the Scots who fought Franco had been severely tested in the fierce Battle of Brunete near Madrid. Little did they know that worse was yet to come. Shortly after the slaughter of Brunete, remaining volunteers and a wave of new recruits from Scotland were sent east to the region of Aragon. There, the British battalion began a mighty offensive towards the fascist-occupied town of Belchite, which they overran in early September after a spell of gruesome hand-to-hand combat. At the end of the Civil War, Belchite was kept as a historical monument. Daniel Gray, author of Homage to Caledonia, continues his journey across Spain with a walk through the ruined streets of this forgotten ghost town and finds memories of war spilling out from every crumbling building.
Everything that was horrific about the Spanish Civil War was epitomised by the battles in Belchite. I sat on the fountain in the square where dead bodies were piled up. A lot of the Scots gave accounts of the stench that was created by that, the summer heat combining with the bodies of not only humans but also animals in a huge pile in the middle. I stood there. I also saw the tower where Barney Shields, a Glasgow Brigader, stood defiantly when he'd been told to retreat and fired down on the fascists and was seen for the very last time firing from that tower. So all of these stories, suddenly it may look like a film set, it may feel like a film set, but they were very, very real things. And so it's very powerful, so powerful and chilling to be in this arena.
It was at Belchite that Cumnock Brigader George Gowans had a life-changing experience.
This was in Belchite, and it was there, it was door-to-door, hand-to-hand fighting. It's a very, very terrible battle there. And they were laying down bombardments right, left and centre. And at the top of Belchite there was a monastery, and the monastery was occupied by the Moors. Now, the Moors are the most ferocious fighters that ever came to Spain. They're terrible. And they had these big Gurkha knives and one thing and another. But we finally brought up the artillery and we managed to get them out. And when we entered this monastery, the nuns had all been raped and shot. And there was one or two still alive. And this one, Sister Katerina, we went over to try and help her. And she died in her arms, as a matter of fact. And she put this round my neck. And she said it would probably keep me safe. Well, I don't know. I seem to remember her in her dying moments. We buried her outside in the grounds, along with the rest of our party there. It was a communal grave and nothing else you could do. There's a burial party. And to me, it was a great significance. I think it was a wonderful gesture at the time, and I treasure it. I've kept a hold of it all these years, and I wouldn't part with it.
Faced with the brutal realities of war, Scots took their pleasures wherever they could. Despite unfamiliar food and customs, they built a strong rapport with the locals.
Life was good, you know, when the bullets and the shells weren't flying around. A lot of the Spanish food I quite like, but we got fed things called garbanzos, which the lads called carabanches, but they're in fact what we call chickpeas, you see. But the British cooks didn't know how to cook these things, and they didn't know you had to soak them overnight, you see. So they used to cook them, and they used to boil them up, and you used to get these things, and they were like bullets. They were like biting wee bullets. And we ate them because we bloody well had to eat them if we didn't want to starve. So, but the thing was this, that they caused tremendous wind problems later on in the day.
The people themselves were so kind and everything and that. You go down into the village and that, and they invite you into their house and that for to have a meal. And I think it was about once a week, or once a fortnight, they used to slaughter a pig. It was pigs. And they used to slaughter a pig. And this was divided up between the whole village and that. You know, it was communal in its sense, because everybody owned everything and that.
There was always a very good relationship. They seemed to think they were indebted to the men of the International Brigade. And they had great respect for us. We were welcomed into their home at any time. They would give us of their last, which was very little, I can assure you. And it was always a pleasure when we got out and rest and got to a village and we could come in contact with the young and the old and have a night with them where they do their best to give us something to eat or something, you know.
We used to, at night times, occasionally we used to have a sing-song, you know. There were quite a lot of Scotch lads there in No. 2 Company, I think in No. 2 Company. We always used to sit around a big bath full of wine and ham and cheese. A slice of ham, a slice of cheese, and you dipped your, as they come round the bath, you just fill your mug with wine, whatever it was they had. But this went until sunset, and after that they were all to bed, yeah.
And the people in the village were marvellous. They used to invite you into their homes, and we couldn't speak very much Spanish, and they used to go like this to you. Now, we didn't know what this little meant, but it means come in, you see. And we thought they were saying ta-ta, and we would sort of move away, and they would say, no, no.
And this lad Alexander and I came to a winery, you know, where they were making wines, and we went and we were looking for beer, and we couldn't get beer. And the Spaniards brought out their wines, and they were extolling all the virtues, the different. So we tasted everything, you know. How we got bought, I don't know. But the next morning, the whole host of drunks lined up.
There's something, and it may be imposed upon it since, but it's a nice thought anyway, something of the Scottish football support going over to Spain. There is a kind of a feeling that they liked their drink, and they were fun, and there was good crack. So I think that was there. It may be a bit romanticised over the years, but I think they were very open people. The men that went were we know them now. You've spoken to them. Were open, fun people who were interested in where they were going to. So they would have been extremely popular.
George Park was 12 when his father Alec, one of the older Scottish volunteers, went to Spain. He wrote home regularly describing the country he found.
I think the International Brigade just missed the cigarette smell. In fact, my father, in his letter, advises my mother to put, used to get 5 woodbine in a wee paper packet. Better to put 2 of these in a letter than anything else. Now, I don't know what like they were when they arrived. Probably they very carefully poured them out, and they had a bit of paper to roll a fag. In his letters, it says, in all sides, they get greeted with salute camarada. He didn't speak Spanish, but says it's one thing we can meet, salute camarada, even the children.
Many of the comforts enjoyed by the volunteers were provided by Scotland's energetic Aid Spain movement. With the British government refusing to intervene in the Spanish Civil War, across the country, ordinary Scots hastily arranged aid organisations. Scotland rallied to the Republican cause with remarkable speed and commitment. The Scottish aid movement was characterised by a poverty-defying generosity above and beyond the call of duty.
Well, there was a massive humanitarian Aid Spain movement, which was carried on by communities, local organised groups, Spanish medical aid committees. Strangely, to an extent, the higher echelons of the trade union movement were very much engaged in the government's policy of non-intervention, and that means not touching it with a barge pole. And I know that certainly a number of trades councils and other union bodies had difficulties in working with aid organisations for Spain because the Communist Party was very involved, and at that time there were what was called the bans and prescriptions on involvement of communists within some of the trade union movement. But the whole movement took off. There was a huge, across the social scale, from the Fife miners right through to the Duchess of Atholl, from very sort of deep poverty, people going that extra mile to make contributions towards the Spanish people.
Every year, history teacher Paul Philippou lays flowers on the grave of James Moyer, a Perth man killed fighting in Spain. Whilst researching the role of Perthshire in the Spanish Civil War, Paul was struck by the Duchess of Atholl's contribution.
The Duchess of Atholl was the first female MP in Scotland, a Conservative MP, and by rights should possibly not have been a Republican supporter. But she travelled to Spain and saw, and what she saw so appalled her. She wrote a book called Searchlight of Spain, which sold over 30,000 copies, and she became an active supporter of the Republic and of democracy in Spain. And that obviously fell foul of her own party, who eventually hounded her out.
Atholl defied her party's stance on the Civil War to spearhead a number of campaigns, becoming chair of the National Joint Committee for Spanish Relief. A conservative, working alongside left-wing groups, she was duly nicknamed the Red Duchess. The Aid Committee organised concerts, fiestas and film showings to raise both funds and awareness, and Flag Days for Spain became a regular feature of Scottish life. A large proportion of Aid for Spain work was carried out by working-class women, the volunteers of the Home Front. They were often inspired by the work of the Red Duchess, demonstrating the social breadth of the aid movement in Scotland. Scots commandeered prams to collect food from door to door, rattled tins on street corners, and energetically organised fundraising events.
My mother was very active. My father, in one letter, asked her to make sure that his union dues, his union cards, paid up. In another letter, he mentions one of the guys who went out with him, guy from Springburn, and would she go up and see his wife? So my mother was very much involved with looking after dependents and things like that. But what I always remember is that on a Saturday, we'd go up, we lived at the bottom of Fakin Street, Duke Street end. We'd go up to the top, to Cumbernauld Road, and the row of shops there, the biggest shop at that time was a cooperative. And we'd go up, we'd have what every family had, the green baize table for playing cards. And we'd have it up for collections for Spain. And women come out to our shops would put a tin of condensed milk, tin of bully beef, tins of this and that, which was for Spain. Sometimes they put a couple of pennies in a wee bowl. And we did that every Saturday, my brother and I. The other thing is a food ship went from Spain and the crew didn't take any wages.
To boost support for the cause, Aberdonian Bob Cooney sent home a Republican flag that had been draped around the bodies of 2 local brigaders slaughtered in Spain.
Bob Cooney had sent it back from Spain. It was used as the shroud for 2 Aberdonians who died in Spain, Archie Dewar and Tom Davidson. And Cooney, in his wisdom, and quite rightly so, decided to send that flag back to the Women's Aid Committee in Aberdeen, who then made a small banner down the side of it from the Aberdeen boys fighting in Spain. And they hung that on the walls in the halls around Aberdeen when they did their meetings to raise aid for Spain.
In Montrose, women were behind the creation of a centre for Basque refugee children exiled from Spain as the Luftwaffe's bombs began to fall on Guernica.
There were a whole range of fundraising activities, concerts, film shows put on around Dundee and the surrounding areas to raise money to keep the Basque children, to feed them. And 24 of them ended up at the Dundee Free Breakfast Missions Holiday Home, which was Mole Park House in Montrose, and 24 arrived there in September 1937. And 2 of them ended up staying after the war. They stayed in Dundee, married Dundonians, and the son of one of them, Tom Boland, was able to unveil a plaque at Mole Park House last October to commemorate the fact that his mother and another 24 Basque children stayed there for a couple of years, fleeing the bombing of the Basque homeland.
Resources were provided too for medical aid committees which supplied doctors and nurses for the hospitals of Spain. Most notable of these was Aberdeenshire-born Annie Murray, whose brothers Tom and George served in the International Brigades. Annie worked as a nurse in Spain for almost the entire duration of the war. She provided an outstanding level of care in torrid conditions, even donating her own blood to patients. Predictably, Annie witnessed more horror in Spain than most. She wrote home to describe one particular incident close to Barcelona.
Italian aeroplanes had dropped pretty little cigarette and chocolate boxes with hand bombs neatly packed inside. The poor little mites of children picking up what they took to be the long-desired chocolate and quickly opening them were suddenly left handless, their faces burned beyond recognition. Nothing could surely be more brutal. What a bloody awful war this has been.
At Belchite, the Scots who fought Franco were unable to hold on for long. In February 1938, the fascists swept into the area and retook the town and neighbouring territory. They pushed the Republican forces into a retreat of 125 miles and back over the strategically crucial River Ebro. The Republican High Command responded with an audacious plan to send 80,000 troops, including the British battalion, back over the Ebro. In July, they began their crossing.
Fighting across the Ebro was pretty fierce at times, and it was there that the Germans were using the tactics of dive bombing the fortified positions, you know.
my number 2 on the gun. I was number 1, he was number 2. There's 7 in every machine gun. The other 5 are handing up ammunition and reloading the belts. And I thought at the time, my number 2 was called out right and I was wounded. And I thought at the time, I said, well, if I'm going to get it, I hope I get it the way he gets it. But I got wounded through the knee, and I was shipped from there up to Las Palmas Hospital above Barcelona to get the wound attended to. However, fortunately, it wasn't a bad wound, and it wasn't long till I rejoined the battalion again. And it was in the second crossing of the Ebro, I got a piece of shrapnel in the head up here. I got this. So I was out of the game for a short time again.
The mass crossing of the Ebro was a monumental success. Emboldened, the British battalion pressed on to the Sierra Pandos, a mountain range in Catalonia. They fought bravely and incurred severe losses through several disastrous attempts at conquering individual summits, such as the infamous Hill 481. Alan Warren became an expert on the Spanish Civil War while living in Britain. He moved to Barcelona and conducts tours of battle sites.
This is the area where Hugh Mackay was, John Dunlop, Steve Fullerton, George Gowans and so many other Scots. What exactly were they here for? What were they trying to achieve?
Well, the 3 International Brigades of the 35th Division had crossed over at Ascol and were trying to drive west to take Gandesa and then follow on and try and reunite with the rest of the Republican Spain. But with such little supplies, they were rebuilding bridges, the bridges were being destroyed, very little supplies coming across. It was literally just people, machine guns, rifles, no heavy support, no mortars, and they were trying to get down Dessa as a modal point to try and move forward. But they were stopped here due to incredible firepower. Steve Fullerton was over on this side. It's a long, narrow ridge. You can barely walk across it. The British were on that side of the hill and the further side, and Steve Fullerton and his company were trying to attack on this side.
We were told to go over and attack this Hill 481, which was a terrible place. That it was so fortified that a fly couldn't have got in there without being found out. And anyway, it was more or less suicide going there to attack that, but we did. And most of our comrades in that particular attack were wounded or killed. And I felt that I was the only one that was still alive, because I'm looking around. I was helping others who had been wounded, bandaging them up and one thing and another. And eventually I was told, find a hole and hide there until it's dark, which I did. I found the hole, but just as I was getting in the hole, I got shot. Somebody was watching me. So that was me.
One thing I do remember is the smell. So I think it was some of the bodies must have been lying there for a day or two. They begin to smell, you know. So they put your sort of hanky over your, or whatever you had over your, maybe they were probably enemy. That was over the top, you know. But at this point, I didn't think as I looked over the top, no sign of the enemy at all, not a sign. No matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything at all. But as soon as I got over the top, my foot to that, the other side just opened up at once. So we all rushed it like an express train down. You can imagine just how fast we run down that hill. Actually, there were 3 of us together, running together. The centre chap shouted, "Oh, I've been hit, I've been hit." And the other chap says, "Keep running, you bastard, keep running." Bullets were simply whoosh. You could whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. You could feel the whoosh, whoosh. You could hear them, and you could actually feel the breeze as it passed them.
They call this place Death Valley because of the number of people who were killed trying to take Hill 481, but generally the whole area. Over in the horizon you can see about 20 or 30 windmills. The plan is to set up something like 250 windmills in a park eolic. And a lot of local people are getting very upset because some of the posters say 100,000 people died in this battle to defend Catalonia against fascism. And now they're destroying and digging up these bones to build these huge wind turbines.
Atop one of the highest mountains on which Scots fought is a monument dedicated to those who fell locally. The roll call includes the names of many Scots.
We've got 90 names here.
2 men from Alexandria alone, which is a very small place. Glenn and Lobban, surely friends.
And a lot of these, they don't know where they're buried, just under some pile of rocks here in Hill 666 and other places.
One name that was so nearly there is that of George Drever from Leith. His granddaughter, Kath Campbell, explains.
He was one of the few people, I think, in the country to have 2 death certificates. He went to Spain early in 1938, and after a couple of weeks training was sent to the Aragon front. And in an offensive, when all of his comrades retreated, George and a couple of others decided mistakenly, as he admitted himself afterwards, not to retreat. Found themselves cut off and were subsequently captured a couple of days later by the fascists. The problem was that his other comrades assumed that they were missing, presumed dead in action, and this was relayed back to Edinburgh, to Leith, to my granny and granddad and George's friends and comrades at the time. And in fact, so much so that my granny my great granny got a death certificate for George and went along to the Peril Assurance Society and claimed £10 death insurance for him, which needless to say she didn't pay back when he turned up then some 9 or 10 months later back in Leith.
So this memorial was unveiled in May 2005 with Jack Jones, Sam Russell, Bob Doyle and Alan Menai Williams, and it commemorates the 90 British volunteers of the battalion who were killed in the Battle of the Ebro.
All these lost bodies somewhere in this valley.
George Park's father, Alec, fought alongside George Drever.
My father often attended conferences and that. So when he went, I suppose, I assumed that it was just to wait another conference. Then eventually my mother told us he'd gone to Spain. So I must say I was immensely proud of him, because as I said, I went round collecting all the signatures of the returning International Brigaders. Oh my own man, it's an idea. It was great. But at the same time, I also realised he was in danger. And when we got the word first that he was missing, well, that was a cause for concern. Then one day, when I came home from school, my mother says to me, George, Dad won't be coming home. You're now the man of the family. Christ, I was 12 years old. Dear George and Eric, in the last letter I wrote to Mum, I said I would write the next one to you, and have chosen today, Sunday, as I have much leisure time, and I hope to tell you at the moment I am sitting on my bed, and directly below, I am one stair up, there is the infant school, which I mentioned before, where the kiddies sing No Passaran, Internationale, and a song about the International Brigade. The wee girls are also... Since I have come here, I have never seen a sweetie, so we'll know especially what the children here have. Some have great red bows in their heads. Well, fellas, I have no more to write just now, so we'll keep close hoping that you, George, have made progress with your violin. I could do fine with you here, Eric, to sew on buttons. I suppose you will be going up to see your grandpa and grandma. Hope you're all well. Your dad's best love. Salute, camaradas.
Must have made you feel very proud.
Aye.
At the end of August 1938, the Scots who fought Franco were holding firm in Catalonian mountains. They remained deeply committed to the cause, despite monstrous conditions and heavy losses. Yet their fate was set not in battle, but in the corridors of power. In late September, the Republican government announced the withdrawal of the International Brigades. They believed that the move would force Hitler and Mussolini to remove their troops from Spain. It was a forlorn hope. Surviving Scots marched through the streets of Barcelona as part of an emotional farewell parade. Hundreds of thousands of Catalans lined the streets to salute the heroes of the International Brigades. The great Republican leader, La Pasionaria, paid tribute to their efforts, telling them, "You can go with pride. You are history. You are legend. We will not forget you."
And you women of Spain, tell your children, tell them of the International Brigade. Tell them how from across the seas and the mountains these men came to our lands. You gave up all to come here and to tell us your cause, the cause of Spain, is ours also. Many of them, thousands of them, remain here, and their shroud is the soil of Spain.
The Spanish Republic the Scots had set out to defend was eventually defeated in the spring of 1939. The fascists marched victorious into Madrid, and Franco established a dictatorship that lasted for 36 years.
I came back with the main British contingent, in beginning of December 1938, and we got a tremendous reception at Victoria Station in London, and then we went. Then after a day or two, the Scots went up in a contingent. We went up in a bus, I think, up to Glasgow, where we were. There was a reception for us in the City Hall in Glasgow, and there was a tremendous reception there.
Throughout his life, George Gowans faced questions about his time in Spain.
They're all interested in why did you go and what did you do? And it's a strange thing that nowadays, when you've been through 2 world wars, nobody asks you what you done in the last World War. They always ask you what you done in Spain. Spain has come prominent in history compared to what it did in these times. But the thing is that I wasn't long back from Spain till the Second World War started. So there wasn't much time of communication between anybody now. And nowadays, if you're asked to go to speak at a burn supper or anything like that, the first thing that comes up is Spain. Yeah. They tell me you're in Spain. What did you do?
Though the sacrifices of international brigaders are not recognised on official war memorials, across the country, ordinary Scots have erected monuments and many more are in the offing. Scotland is refusing to forget. John Tadden, John McClanders, Malcolm Smith, Andrew Finnan, Ken Stalker, Dave Sampson, John Ness,
John Black,
William
John Moody,
Tom Brown,
Tom Buck,
Pat Curley,
Adam
James, John Gould, Charlie Massad, James Murray, Ken Harris,
James Carroll, John
Alex
McDade,
John Ross,
Adam
Davis,
Meredith.
I've seen people reduced to tears, remembering friends who died, Scottish friends who died, Spanish friends who died. And I know of, there are some people who don't like to talk about it at all, and their families say that they very seldom talked about it afterwards because of the horrors that they saw and the incredible, incredible courage they must have had to face every day. So there must have been a turning point somewhere between the great hope, and that in itself is almost like a microcosm of the war itself. The great hope of the middle of the 20th century, of the world could be a much better, more egalitarian, more just place. And then you suddenly see, the whites of Franco's troops' eyes or the Nazi troops in the later war. But I still think they brought away with them a sense of hope. Okay, we were defeated in that one. And it was hell for Spain particularly. But the very fact that so many people spontaneously rose up, made their own way to Spain, small groups of people, is in itself a fantastic source of hope.
The democracy Scottish volunteers fought to protect in Spain was not restored until after Franco's death in 1975. In contrast to Scotland, there was a desire in Spain to forget the Civil War. Journalist Sid Lowe discovered the reasons behind this when he moved to Madrid to cover Spanish football for the Guardian newspaper.
One of the key factors in the transition from post-Francoism and his regime into a democratic regime, which they have now, was a collective pact of silence, a collective pact of forgetting. And it was very consciously, let's not talk about the past as a way of moving on to the future. Culturally, I think psychologically, emotionally and socially, Spain is still a country that's marked by what happened, not just between 1936 and 1939, but of course for the next 40 years under a Franco dictatorship.
Journalist and author Giles Tremlett describes the impact of this silence on daily life.
One of the things we've discovered from this whole process is that Spaniards don't still agree on what happened during the Civil War. They don't agree on the interpretation of the Civil War. They don't agree about how good or bad Franco was. They don't even agree about what the Republic was like, whether it was good or bad. And so all those old wounds, if you want, which had been silenced during Franco's years and then sort of kept under the carpet during the first years of democracy, well, all those things have reappeared. When I've gone to speak to people in villages, I found that often you can be talking to someone perfectly normally in the street about what happened during the Civil War, and that suddenly a neighbour will walk by and that they'll either shut up completely or start whispering to you, simply because they don't want that neighbour to hear what they're saying, because that neighbour was almost certainly on the other side of the Civil War. His family was on the other side of the Civil War, and there's blood between them. Some people say there were two sides to the Civil War. Another theory is that actually there were 2,000 sides to the Civil War, that each village was divided in two, and that actually what really hurts in Spain is the fact that the killings were done in each village by other people from that village, and that after the bloodbath was over, everybody had to keep on living together, and that was the real problem.
The end of the Pact of Silence has allowed many developments in Spain. The efforts of Emilio Silva have perhaps been the greatest vehicle for change. What began for Emilio as a search for his grandfather's remains has turned into a countrywide quest to dig up mass graves of Republican victims, as he explains.
10 years ago, I left my job in a magazine to write a book about my grandfather. He was a political militant during the Second Republic. He was killed by the Phalangists in 1936, and then I went to the area in the northwest of Spain where he lives, and I started to talk with old people about the Civil War and the years after the Civil War. And then I found a man, a communist militant, who said, "I know the place of the grave of your grandfather." And some months later, with a group of archaeologists and forensic doctors, we opened the mass grave. I identified my grandfather with a DNA test, and I put his bones with my grandmother.
Now Spaniards are digging in their thousands to find their own relatives' remains. But it is not only in Spain that these excavations are impacting. Retired fireman Alan Craig from Drumchapel was a toddler when his father, also Alan, was killed at the Battle of Jarama.
He was taken to a field hospital in Tarragona, where he died 5 days later. He was then given a decent burial in the cemetery just next to the hospital. But after the war, the fascists moved in and desecrated all the graves. Now, the people who were the Republicans, they were, along with my father, they were all turfed over this wall at the cemetery into a refuse pit. Oh, I was actually horrified at first because, I thought, wait a minute, this is not a way to treat a dead person, no matter whose side you're on,
Until recently, Alan had never even seen a photograph of his father.
I wrote again to the Friends of the International Brigade, and they told me to get in touch with the Marxist Museum, our library in London. And they said to me, yes, we've got a photograph of your father. And I said, well, is there any chance of purchasing it, a copy? They said, certainly, £20. So I said, it's a bargain, you know. But when the photograph came in a big envelope, I thought, I don't know what to expect, you know. And the strange thing was, as soon as I opened up, I knew right away which one was my father. I was so delighted, very humble. My daughter even, she was in tears. That was it's quite a very humbling experience.
Alan is determined to use Spain's newfound openness to locate and rebury the body of his dad.
Okay, so this is us playing a game, the fascists.
Like Alan, the relatives of those who fought in Spain still live with the war's legacy. John Dunlop's son Norman has redesigned a war game featuring some of the locations in which his father fought.
And I've just used it as a kind of tool to learn about the war, because I didn't really understand my dad's experience of it very well, but because the game has given me a focus around which to sort of organise knowledge about the war, then it's, you know, matched up my interest in wargaming and computers with my dad's life experience. One of the things I would say about him is that the media is interested in him as the interesting thing that he did in media terms, which is going and fighting in Spain. But to me, he was a great dad. And that is the most important thing about him to me. Now, that he fought in Spain is a good thing. It's a heroic thing that he did. And I think, you know, to me, he was sort of my hero, even as an adult.
Willie Maley is a professor at Glasgow University. With his brother John, he wrote a play about their father Jimmy's imprisonment in Spain. The ideals that led Jimmy into joining the International Brigades influenced his everyday life.
We didn't have to worry about raids under the bed. We had a raid tucking us into bed at night. I think it did affect us. I mean, my father was teetotal. He never drank, never smoked. There was 9 pints of milk in the bath because we didn't have a fridge. There was 9 pints of milk in the bath. He was on the side of the underdog. That's one thing that's true about him. But he wasn't he was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. But I would say he wasn't necessarily a dogmatist. He had his dogmas, you know, and he had his very strong views. By God, he had his strong views, you know what I mean? And I think that's a good thing. We lived in a street where it's a true story. There were people sometimes out without shoes, and my father would come up and get a pair of shoes and give them it. Now, because we had nothing, we didn't always like the idea of my father going down and giving things to other people. But you always knew there were people poorer than you because you could look out the window and see them.
You know, when I was about 5, I always remember a guy stopping me as I was going into our stair, and he said, "Your father's a dirty communist." And I went, "Oh no, he's a clean one," you know.
Jenny Renton runs a bookshop in Edinburgh. She has lived with the legacy of her father Don's time in Spain.
I think I am proud of him. Very proud of him, really. I admired his courage hugely. He had a beautiful smile and a great warmth. What I would have liked would to be able to remember my childhood and remember playing a game with him.
Though they could not defeat Franco, the Scots that went to Spain had squared up to fascism before the rest of the world got around to it. Scotland can be proud of them.
We are very, 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 very grateful for these people because for me it's the most solidarity of one people is take his life to fight for the freedom in another country.
I can't quote it word for word, but it goes, "For evil to succeed, it only takes good men to do nothing." And these were good men, and they did something. And I think it's an example that we can take today to make sure that evil doesn't succeed.
No, I don't regret going, no. I'm quite pleased of it. I mean, I thought it was something that should have been done, you know.
Oh, it's one of the greatest experiences of my life. It's the highlight of my life, apart from being married and having my family.
I'm only sorry we lost.
It was, I think, probably the most inspiring moment of my life.
Even if I live to be 100, I'll always be glad I went to Spain.
This programme is available at stv.tv/Franco and on the STV player.